It's Jelena Starcevik.
Okay, thank you very much. From McMaster University, a doctoral candidate in labor studies, studying the regulation of platform work in Southeast Europe. So the presentation today is called Platform Work in Southeast Europe, a case study of Croatia and Serbia. So off to you, Jelena.
Thanks, Véronique, for that nice introduction. As you said, the title of the presentation is self-evidentary. So I'll be talking about the platform work in Southeast Europe, especially looking at on-location platforms operating in Croatia and Serbia. So my interest in looking at platform work in this region in particular stems from the fact that research showed that Central and Eastern Europe, but particularly the region of Southeast Europe, represent certain specific characteristics that is mainly organized through use of third-party or additional intermediaries that intervene in the relationship between platforms and workers. And these findings kind of go against the dominant narrative that we hear about platform work as transforming employment into self-employment. So my concern was really understanding what drives this reconfiguration of platform work in this region. To do so, I draw from a broader institutional theory, which ascertains that institutions are norms, formal norms or rules, or societal and cultural practices that create certain expectations of behavior from companies or individuals. And while there are a variety of streams within the institutional theory, they kind of all agree that the way the economy is structured and employment practices are configured largely depends on the institution within the national frameworks. Applying the institutional lens to the studies of platform work has been a novel approach, as Wallace and Shore said, empirically least developed, but also least deterministic, because we can see how these interactions play differently in different institutional arrangements. First, studies that apply institutional theory really looked at what kind of institutional characteristics are congenial to the emergence of platform business model. And we know that pro-market like the regulated system with high cultures of entrepreneurship, where contravailing organized interests, either on the part of workers or industry, are weak, are where these platform business models first occur. More and more studies are looking at the impact of different platform business model and institutional arrangement on workers' outcomes. And here we are really seeing the divergence in full display, that in some countries the way regulation is set up or institutional arrangements are set up can effectively exempt platforms from taking statutory employment responsibility, or they can incentivize them to directly engage workers as their employees. Also, on another side, regarding workers, institutional arrangements also play important role in, for instance, incentivizing engaging in informal work or incentivizing formal work. So with this, I set out to do my field work because interviews with workers and key stakeholders were my main source of data. I conducted a total of 110 semi-structured interviews with workers who are active on transportation platforms, Uber and Cargo, and on food delivery platforms, Global Volt in Croatia and Serbia. In addition, I interviewed 23 key stakeholders from relevant ministry, trade unions, employers' organization, academia, and civil sector representatives. So not surprisingly, my first finding is that I also encountered the predominant use of third-party contractor to organize platform work. If you look at the figure, you see that in both countries, in both sectors, the use of third-party contractor is predominant way of organizing platform work. The interviews I conducted have been really instructive in understanding how this model occurred and got applied in this region. The transportation platform companies, Uber and Cargo, that first appeared in the boat market had to organize the provision of their services against the very high barriers to entry imposed by sector regulation. And these are barriers in terms of both licensing and in terms of restriction on the number of licenses that are issued by a competent authority. The way they circumvented taxi regulation was by using a provision that exists in both regulation that allows for a company to provide service of transportation by renting a vehicle with a driver. And this is considered a special type of transportation that doesn't have to comply with taxi regulation. So the platform model was initially configured so that platform companies would conclude partnership agreements with companies registered to provide this specific type of transportation, who would then hire workers. When food delivery platforms came to the market, they just replicated this model. It has to be said that at some point, and especially when both countries reformed their sectoral regulation, there was a big push from platform companies to transform these employers to third-party contractor into self-employed, but it faced a really big resistance from the workers. And to understand, this is very important to understand the whole model, because on one side, the regulation has influenced the model, but on the other side, workers themselves didn't want to become self-employed. And this can be explained by highly regulated performance of business activities in both countries, which is kind of legacy of socialist era, and low entrepreneurial culture, also stemming from the period when they belonged to the Yugoslavia, where entrepreneurship was very marginal and very highly regulated. So the fact that workers, it's a very cumbersome, highly regulated administrative burdens to open their own firms, but also they don't see entrepreneurship as something desirable to do. This unattractiveness of entrepreneurship is even more exaggerated in platform work, because most workers see this as a temporal job that they just do to bridge between two employments, or because of perceived risk, especially in Serbia, where performing taxi transportation to platforms is still illegal. The illegality of the activity really deters people from performing this as self-employed. The second two findings I want to share with you today deal with work arrangement found within this model of third-party contractors. So there are some very interesting findings regarding the levels of formality and informality. As you can see, in food delivery sector in Serbia, most workers perform this activity without no contract, totally informal, while in Croatia we have almost a very large level of formality. In transportation sector, we have a kind of an opposite picture, where in Serbia we have highly formalized employment, while in Croatia 1/3 of workers perform this activity informally. The main reason that factor that explains these differences is the state intervention. The enforcement of existing regulation have really translated all the informal workers in food delivery sector in Croatia into formality. Up to 2022, this was also a sector characterized by high informality, but with joint action from tax and labor inspection, now we see it is almost completely formalized. In Serbia, the reason then is lack of state enforcement. If there is any possible justification for this lack of state activity, it's because food delivery sector in Serbia is far less developed than in Croatia. In Croatia, they estimate about 50 to 60,000 workers working on food deliveries, while in Serbia, it's less than 1% of workforce. Also, there are some interesting dynamics regarding incentives of deterrence from institutional arrangement about whether workers accept or decline informality. The two interviews I had with Volt couriers were very illustrative of this example. One Volt courier driver said that the reason he has that employment contract is because he needed it to formalize the access for his kid to the kindergarten, to the state kindergarten. So he needed employment contract, regular incomes on banks and things like that. So his third-party contractor said, okay, I'll give it to you, but that's not really profitable. The other example is from a medical student also working on Volt. His employee, third-party contractor, contacted him about a month and a half, 2 months that he was working and said, I'm super happy with the way you work hard, you have a lot of deliveries, I want to conclude an employment contract with you. And the poor guy said, oh, can we please continue working informally as we did? Because if he gets an employment status, he loses his student benefits. And his student benefits is how he gets the accommodation, the housing, and the meals. So while performing platform work is nice to have some extra money, really the student benefits is how he maintains his substance. And also, when we look at the formal arrangements, there is another very interesting finding, and that is that these formal arrangements in both countries are characterized by predominance of quasi-formality. Across both countries, across all sectors, all interview workers said that they received envelope wages. So they have a minimum contractual salary, and everything they earn in reality, they get as an envelope wages. While this is similar to the both countries, the vehicles of these quasi-formalities are different. In Croatia, most third-party contractors use part-time contracts, while in Serbia, most third-party contractors use full-time employment contracts, more likely on fixed term than on indefinite term. The reasons for this, again, can be found in institutional configuration and particularly in interaction between labor, tax, and social security regimes. To kind of cut the story short, part-time contracts in Croatia are the cheapest in terms of calculating wages, work-related compensation, tax, social security, pensions, health insurance, and things like that. In Serbia, the way tax and social security regimes interacts with part-time employment contract, it makes it more expensive. So the way Serbian third-party contractor try to reduce the work-related cost is by concluding a full-time employment contract, but decreasing the reported salary. So all contracts are a minimum salary to decrease the burdens on the wages. What is interesting and how this kind of is a novelty when we talk about undeclared employment, that is generally a characteristic of both countries, is that in literature, usually it is the employer who seeks to reduce tax and social security contribution. However, we see a new dynamic unfolding in platform work because here all related costs are transferred to workers. So workers have to earn their wages, they have to pay for their social security contribution, they pay the tax. So everything, all the expenses are borne by the workers. So because of this transfer of the cost, we now see more decision to engage in undeclared employment is kind of joint decision between employer and employee, or even more instigated by the employee themselves. So these findings altogether offer important insights in how platform companies reconfigure their operation in different regulatory settings, especially those with high regulation and that do not encourage flexible earnings and entrepreneurship. And also these new models produce different concerns over commodification of work and raise important practical questions, especially in policy domain when countries try to regulate this platform work, because now they're not dealing with misclassification of work, but they're dealing with more complex intermediation relationship where there are multiple parties involved. Thank you very much. I look forward to other presentation and questions.
Thank you so much, Jelena. That was very interesting. Yeah, thanks. That's great. Okay, so just as a reminder, if anybody has any questions that you can think of now, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll bring them back up when we get to our Q&A portion, but before you forget what your questions for Jelena might be, feel free to pop them in there now. So yeah, thank you again. And our next presenter is Maya Campo from York University. She's a master's student in geography studying gig work and masculinities. And the presentation is Masculinity and Gig Work, a case study of rideshare workers in Toronto. So off to you, Maya.
Okay, perfect. So my presentation is titled Masculinity and Gig Work, a case study of rideshare workers in Toronto. So what sparked my interest first wasn't necessarily the gig economy, but the personal lives of rideshare workers whom I've had conversations with. We've talked about whether they enjoy their job, whether they make enough money, whether they have a partner, children. Some have been familiar with the concept of gig work and identified with the label gig worker, which usually came along with either praise about the work, complaints, or a combination of both. So here's a brief outline of the structure of my presentation. So the problem and argument, research questions, theoretical methods, preliminary findings, discussion implications, and then some further work. So the topic of my research specifically is rideshare work in the gig economy and shifting masculinities. I've been conducting field work with Uber and Lyft male rideshare workers with dependents as participants in the Greater Toronto Area. So for the purpose of this project, I will be employing Woodcock and Graham's understanding of work in the gig economy, which is that it is precarious, non-standard, and can be characterized by typically short-term projects where workers are hired through digital marketplaces and where technologies of automation and control are utilized. This definition most accurately describes employment through Uber and Lyft. So before I state my argument, I want to identify the problem with Uber and organizing. Gray, 2022, asserts that the Foodsters United campaign successfully organized gig work utilizing traditional workplace organizing tactics. Aslam and Woodcock assert that classic organizing methods can effectively organize gig workers, however, with adaptations to account for a spatially dispersed workforce, algorithmic control, and customers' ratings on apps. So while the previously mentioned assertions may ring true, what both analyses leave out and what most of the scholarship on organizing gig work does not consider is how workers' personal and family lives may impact the viability of classic organizing methods. While employment patterns have not shifted to radically restructure the unevenness of paid and unpaid work between men and women, with the erosion of the male breadwinner, female caregiver gender contract, and the rise of dual earner households, it is argued that in many cases, men are now secondary caregivers as opposed to solely primary breadwinners. Thus, more men are being implicated in the social reproduction process. I am arguing that organizing methods for gig workers need to be rethought to account for shifting masculinities and workers' implication in the social reproduction process. So, gendered relationship dynamics and how they interact with labor market relations have historically impacted the organization of work. Those with a non-standard employment relationship, so often only blue-collar white men, were often organized into trade unions that were modeled to sustain the male breadwinner, female caregiver, gender contract of work. Thus, gendered relationship dynamics permeated the organization of work. So non-standard work has been commonly done by women, hence the proliferation of non-standard work being contextualized as the feminization of work. In contrast, rideshare work is a non-standard form of gig work done predominantly by men. So this makes rideshare work a relevant form of gig work to examine with its complex relationship to the gendered history of non-standard work. If hegemonic masculinities are shifting and reshaping, organizing tactics should reshape to account for this. So I posed the primary research questions of, are male rideshare workers reconstructing hegemonic masculinities, or are new forms of masculinities in workers emerging? I'm asking a second question of, do male rideshare workers engage in this work to balance paid work with unpaid social reproductive work, or to supplement other income-generating activities and maintain the male breadwinner role? So here's a quick outline of my theoretical framework. A social reproductive lens is crucial for understanding the gender division of paid and unpaid labor, and how unpaid social reproductive work reproduces labor power and pushes capitalism along. Feminist political economy is critical of the sole focus of the capitalistically productive economy in traditional political economy, and it emerged out of Marxist feminist and socialist feminist scholarship. Feminist geography allows for a critical analysis between masculinities, space, place, and temporality. It acknowledges that masculinities are inherently raced as well. Literature on masculinities focuses on hegemonic, dominant forms of masculinities that reproduce patriarchal domination, and also shifting and reforming masculinities. So while these theoretical frameworks I've discussed have been in conversation with one another, there's been generally a lack of conversation between these scholarships and work in the gig economy, but there's an especially significant gap between gig work literature and construction of masculinities and shifting gender norms. So my interviews have all been semi-structured and over Zoom, with 10 participants interviewed so far. With Uber and Lyft work, there's an absence of a singular spatially definitive workplace. My original proposed recruitment method was recruitment on the go, which would have been done by handing drivers a card with my information on it after a ride, and briefly stating that I'm a master's student doing research on rideshare workers. I stated I would inform drivers that their rating or tip would not be affected by whether they choose to participate or not. So though my supervisor and I insisted that any possible element of coercion would have been eliminated, ethics didn't approve this method of recruitment, and we used Facebook postings and purposive sampling instead. So I've begun preliminary coding using, oops, one second. Okay, so I have begun preliminary coding using Deduce. Relevant findings include all participants being married, with no deviations from heterosexuality to my knowledge. 9 out of 10 interview transcripts were coded with breadwinning norm, meaning that overall, the participant does more paid work while their wife does most of the unpaid social reproductive work. 7 out of 10 interviews were coded with woman primary caregiver, and 8 out of 10 were coded with balancing jobs, and the majority of those participants were balancing Uber with a full-time job. So here's some quotes from participants highlighting the male breadwinner norm and also some deviations from it. Some participants make a clear distinction between divisions of paid and unpaid domestic labor between them and their partner, highlighting the reproduction of hegemonic masculinity, while some highlight their part-time caregiving responsibilities and housework, showing some deviations. Several participants worked from home and would do Uber on evenings and weekends, meaning they could balance childcare throughout the day with their partner at home. So this one here highlights, no, she's a housewife from day one. This one up here acknowledges that they both take care of the baby, and while his partner is at home and they both work from home, it makes it easier. This one here says he's always out doing the paid work while his wife is at home doing the unpaid social reproductive work. So what does this mean? Well, many participants are maintaining the male breadwinner norm, and most are balancing Uber with full-time work. They are also, even if part-time, implicated in the social reproduction process. So here's another quote from a participant expressing a loss of family time upon driving for Uber. Multiple other participants also expressed similar sentiments. So many participants expressed a desire for a union while simultaneously expressing a lack of time for community building with other rideshare workers. Lack of time is an ongoing theme, lack of time for expression of solidarity and community, and also lack of time for family. Participants expressed other perceived barriers to the idea of a union, including surveillance from Uber, competition from other rideshare companies, and the simple lack of communication with other workers. So these findings could have implications for organizing gig work around the worker as a whole, taking into consideration not only spatial dispersion and algorithms, but also workers' family and work-life dynamics that are shifting and shaping in the context of precarious labor markets. So it's been noted by scholars that in precarious contexts, including the precarity of gig work, coping with negative emotions collectively makes work and life more tolerable. A study on male drivers in Vietnam asserts that camaraderie was forged through workers' collective sharing of emotions regarding challenges to their masculinity. These findings can be interpreted to reveal possible potential for solidarity amongst Canadian male rideshare workers, and perhaps an avenue towards organizing as opposed to a barrier. So for further work, and one important thing I want to note is that this project was not originally intended to be a project on South Asian masculinities in Canadian precarious labor markets. However, all my participants ended up being South Asian, and this must become part of the project as it is part of all my participants' lived experiences. As asserted by Connell, hegemonic masculinities are layered and constructed by racialization, citizenship, and class. So my theoretical framework must also incorporate scholarship on South Asian masculinities. I want to do this in a way that does not relegate it to an afterthought, and I'm still in the early stages of analysis, so I didn't want to incorporate this into the presentation in a way that does not do it justice. I'm also open to any suggestions on how to do this well and how to do this with care. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. That's really interesting. I appreciate seeing research unfold and change as it goes. Thank you very much. And a reminder again to folks, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat and I'll save them for Maya for the end. Okay, our next presenter is Gerard de Trolio from McMaster University, a PhD candidate in labor studies, studying platform worker unions. And his presentation is A Necessary Strategy, the Need to Organize Platform Workers. So off to you.
All right. So this sort of project came about during my research for my dissertation. I got to thinking about this because I'm just about to actually undertake the research for my dissertation. That's sort of all approved. I'm getting the interviews together, but through reading things, through thinking things through, there's this idea I read in this really great book, Class-Struggle Unionism by Joe Burns, that came out last year. How to build these militant unions. He's talking about certain ideas of how the labor movement sometimes will get into these sort of like passing trends that they think can transform the labor movement, and sort of was dismissive of this idea of organizing gig or platform workers, referred to it as a fixation among some in the labor movement. But over the course of my work, in my research and preparing for my literature review, I thought that that was sort of a wrong-headed approach. And also, there's been a lot of discussion about what are the sort of the strategic industries of the 21st century to organize in order to sort of rebuild and renew the labor movement. And that discussion is not only the gig economy or platform economy, but we talk about that in care work, talk about that in logistics, and just the need to organize the service sector more generally. So as I see it, and I have other scholars that see it, like there's sort of in the North American context, like past successes of the labor movement also sowed the seeds for its defeat. And I'm talking here in like the US and Canada with sort of like the Wagner model. So what that meant was this institutionalization sort of curved militancy, and it restricted strikes to between contract periods. You cannot strike over health and safety issues or other grievances on the spot. And also, you had this situation where essentially that the union leadership were often acting as sort of disciplinarians, making sure that there were no wildcats and things like that. And sort of tied to this, and sort of the idea of how, all of these corporations and the platform economy could emerge in the way that they have, is by sort of focusing on wages and benefits. And this is going all the way to like the deals with the big three automakers, sort of relevant to what's going on right now, is that, the UAW back in 1948 basically traded any sort of shop floor control and issues of introduction of new technologies to basically they're going to focus on wages and benefits. So that sort of disempowered unions at the point of production. So within this context, we're going to ask where unions are falling behind. Obviously, very relevant to platform work, technology. There's really only been a small number of unions that have been able to regulate the introduction of new technology in the workplace, most notably ILWU on the west coast of the United States. They have had some success in controlling the introduction of new technology to the ports, but I mean, ultimately, and even with the increase in global trade, ultimately the number of workers needed for these, shipping ports in places like Long Beach, California, is decreased since the 1960s. And what we've seen is both in the global north and global south is heavy labor market dualization. And this has had an impact on solidarity. So existing union members and existing unions may be somewhat hesitant to try to organize those in non-standard forms of work. They see it as a threat to their workers, and they see these increases in non-standard forms of work, as threats to the industries that they're already organized in. But there are exceptions. What we've seen is, particularly in some countries in the global south, where you have like a mass of those in non-standard employment, there are still sectors where that are still have strong union presence. I think of the work done by Spooner and Manwanika about transport workers union in Uganda. Basically, their strength was basically confined to Entebbe International Airport in Kampala. But what they managed to do is reach out to sort of like taxi drivers and that sort of thing who are in non-standard forms of employment to actually increase the power of the union. And then, of course, there's the fissured workplace, which means, the fact of subcontracting out and franchisees. And what this leads to is, most famously in the case of like the Justice for Janitors campaign, it wasn't these buildings that they were targeting had contracted out the janitorial work, and often some of these companies, when faced with the threat of unionization, would basically fold or declare bankruptcy, and then another sort of janitorial services firm would pop up in their place. And of course, given the very low profit margins in these industries, there is heavy pressure to cut costs as much as possible. And given the lack of teeth on a lot of labor law, a lot of like minimum wages and employment standards were being skirted, which makes it, of course, and this all makes it harder to organize these workers. And like within like the Justice for Janitors case, that's why they targeted the buildings themselves, because they couldn't get these firms. So it was like, the kind of creative organizing that I think is going to have to apply to the platform economy in many ways. And then, there's questions of organizing non-standard forms of employment and how to do it. Aslam and Woodcock and Gray have also sort of identified how traditional strategies have operated in this way, person-to-person visits and everything like that. But there's also new things going on. Maffei has sort of studied how, digital communities, whether they be on Facebook or WhatsApp groups, have brought workers together in, organizing, if not for unions, but just to try to assert their rights and sort of improve their conditions. And then, where I think it's fair, when I talked about sort of the idea of organizing the strategic industries of the 21st century, I think it's fair to say that unions have ultimately fallen behind on that. Amazon organizing somewhat stalled, like even the one that was organized by the Amazon warehouse union, they don't have a contract yet. Things are ongoing in there. There's been some attempts at platform organizing around the world, but nothing quite certified like a traditional union. So you see with Gig Workers United, what they've done is sort of gone to a community union model where anyone who does gig work for any platform can sign up. So you could have, you know, Lyft drivers, Uber drivers, TaskRabbit people, and that sort of thing. So that is still something that obviously, you know, it's still being contested. I can't say that this has been, you know, a failure or anything like that, but it's something that's still ongoing, and obviously there's still very real challenges to that. And I should add also with in the question of organizing strategic industries and non-standard forms of employment, sort of you've had new forms of organization emerge, including a number of independent organizations that are not tied to existing unions. And so that also is sort of a question of, you know, why are these new sort of radical small indie unions, as they're often called, why are they emerging in the place of the traditional labor movement? And so what unionizing platform workers could mean? I mean, it's a question of getting ahead of technological change. We're already talking about how technological change has put unions on the back foot. They haven't been able to respond to it. Well, now we have not just the platforms sort of emerging, but you know, now we have the AI to deal with, and that's a huge question that still has to be dealt with. And I know that that is going to be obviously something that's going to be contested, and, you know, probably heavily in the next decade, forcing labor law to catch up. Obviously, labor law and regulation and politics more generally wasn't prepared for this, and this is why sort of Uber could go into a lot of these major cities and seemingly sort of steamroll them. I know that, you know, many cities, including Toronto, have tried to sort of put up some sort of resistance to it being heavily unregulated. Some have gotten certain regulations in place, but at the same time, mostly, you know, Uber's sort of vision has been mostly protected. And so, you know, and obviously with Uber, you know, they have also spent millions and millions of dollars on lobbying. They spent, all the platforms spent millions and millions of dollars sort of to defeat that referendum in California that would have given employment protections to gig workers. So in this regard, there are limits to labor law, but and which sometimes unions fall back on. It makes often unions complacent. I think that's sort of the case in North America. And what this can do is obviously improve the labor law, but at the same time, you still want unions that can respond to, you know, changes in the economy and everything like that, and not solely rely on the law. Another important element is building alliances with migrant worker groups. The gig economy in the global north is heavily racialized. What you have is, you know, as Maya was just talking about, also you have the case of questions of citizenship. You have a lot of international students doing platform work in Canada. You have a lot of migrant workers who may not be who are undocumented, and there's ways to get around sort of verification systems for some of these platforms, and so they engage in that, and that is a huge issue in terms of, you know, renewing unions, improving unions that can represent and fight on behalf of all workers. And tied to that is increasing the diversity in the labor movement, just not having a more diverse membership, but also a more diverse leadership that can come from, you know, platform work and understand the needs and challenges and interests that these workers face based on race and their citizenship and the industry that they work in. And also the innovation of organizing strategies. Touched on this a little more, but there's more to it as well. There's also the issue of, well, how do platform workers exert their power? You know, they can do it associationally, or trying to, although obviously coming together can be challenging. But there's also issues of, you know, can they, when they strike, what are they striking? Obviously, because what you have traditionally is the picket line, do not cross, management, or replacement workers cannot get into the building, you shut production down and everything like that. And so that there's been sort of interesting work sort of understanding about how, and this is generally the rideshare drivers, like Uber drivers, they sort of organize in regards of, okay, so they'll all go to an airport, because that's sort of a choke point within the gig economy, because there's lots of demand for taxis at airports and like that, so that they can leverage their power that way. There's also sorts of ways of messing with the algorithm by a bunch of people asking for rides and then canceling them at the last minute, which messes up the algorithm. So these sort of ways to be disruptive within the platform economy, because obviously the idea was this atomization and this control by algorithm was going to curb worker power, but ultimately there are still ways to get around that. So, there's obviously a lot of talk about this idea, okay, unions are no longer relevant. Obviously many workers have, the rise of the HR department, and there's employment standards and everything like that. Not sufficient, I would say, and I think most would agree. But, if the labor movement sort of doesn't bother getting into and involved in the platform economy, it's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it's not going to be able to keep up with these changes and transformations in the world of work. I'm sure that work from home is obviously something that also too is something that the labor movement is going to have to deal with and come up with strategies for and everything like that ongoing. So if the labor movement is going to continue to remain relevant, it has to be ahead of the curve on these transformations. And also in U.S. and Canada, there's been this attention to this agreement between, in Canada, FCW and Uber, and in New York State, sort of the Independent Drivers Guild in UMER. And there's been a lot of controversy about that. And so, my position is that it's going to turn these workers against unions more generally, because of the coziness between these unions, these organizations, and the platforms. It's very clear that the reporting that has come out that, very backroom negotiating between USCW and Uber here in Canada, and also what these sort of these representative ideas and organizations are supposed to sort of lack, that's supposed to be key to a vibrant labor movement, and basically sort of the basis of it is this lack of democracy. And so the idea is, workers can have power within a union and can have a say, which should be, the very basis of what unions are a democratic organization of workers. That is lacking in these arrangements, and I think that is going to be very corrosive to how an Uber driver somewhere in Canada may choose to and feel about accessing, the services that are provided by UFCW. And what these leave out, both of these agreements ultimately leave out, are the question of classification. What the unions have basically retreated on to get these sort of sweetheart deals is that they lack still, the drivers for Uber still lack actual employment status. They're still considered independent contractors, and all of the sort of problems that entails. Basically, what these agreements are for is that sometimes maybe they can bring up some health and safety issues, or probably the most useful element, if one had to choose from these sort of deals, is that you can have these UFCW or the IDG challenge deactivations, which is obviously a very huge issue on these platforms. But I think on the whole, sort of the lack of say and democracy and improvement in the employment status, these organizations are going to do more harm than good for how the labor movement is perceived by gig workers. And so that is my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's solid analysis there. Thank you. That was really great. Yeah, and again, a reminder: feel free, folks, to note your questions in the comments, and I'll save them for the end. I'm keeping mine on a notepad. So next we have Benjamin Anderson from Simon Fraser University, a recent PhD and lecturer in the School of Communication there, presenting digital circuits as aspirational and leisure work, craft in the platform economy. So off to you, Ben.
Sorry, with the double screen and the screen share, I had trouble finding how to unmute myself there.
No worries, no worries.
Hi, everybody. So in a general sense, my research concerns the working conditions, the political economic structures, and labor processes of craft, digital, and cultural industries. Specifically, it interrogates the interaction between the analog and digital dimensions of the 21st century production, ultimately in order to amplify the voices of workers. Specifically today, I'm presenting a new direction that my research is taking, one that considers the informal and aspirational forms of work that characterize much of the emerging craft economy. As this is an emerging focus, my approach today is an exploratory one. So my plan is to give you an overview of my research with craft and artisanal workers to work toward a proposal of an interrogation of the intersections of the craft and platform economies. In a sense, today's presentation is a kind of guided review with an eye to the future. We should, of course, begin by defining some terms. The research I'm presenting today orbits around the term craft, a term famous for its imprecision. In fact, as art critic Peter Dormer put it, following designer David Pye, craft is a good term to use to start an argument. There are any number of definitions out there, most of which amount to something along the lines of doing good work for its own sake. Such definitions focus on the motivations for production, but don't necessarily delve into the contextual considerations with which we're going to concern ourselves today. For the purpose of today's discussion, I'll use the definition I offer in my dissertation. Craft is that segment of work in the global north animated by the purported desire to produce high-quality material commodities, often in small-scale local contexts and culturally reinforced through narratives of creative autonomy, social distinction, and sustainability. Although the output of craft production is markedly material, craft is fully integrated into the circuits of the digital economy. Its products often traded on e-commerce platforms like Etsy, and its processes mediated by digital technologies, including laser cutters and 3D printers. It's worth noting that considerable academic work has been dedicated to the emergence of the craft economy. Most of this considers craft at the level of the object and its consumption, essentially interrogating the consumer side of the current wave of craft enthusiasm. A less dominant focus considers craft at the point of production or in relation to the craftsperson or maker. Typically, this follows one of two dominant streams. The first focuses on the activities and motivations of the individual maker. Generally, these accounts see the maker as a champion of individual determination, hard work, and commitment to tradition and excellence. The other major stream of inquiry considers the livelihoods enjoyed by craftspeople and the ways in which policy might be mobilized to improve these. Work in this stream questions the narratives of craft discourse, usually in a macro-level sociological sense. There's considerably less work currently that interrogates the labor process of craft production and its distinction from or similarity to other contemporary modes of accumulation, particularly in relation to the digital economy. What remains to be seen, in a sense, is the degree to which the enterprises that position themselves as craft actually reflect the meanings that that moniker implies. In the dissertation, and by extension today, I argue that the experiences of workers in craft industries suggest that these industries, far from embodying the care, community orientation, and fairness that craft discourse celebrates, actually commonly rely heavily on a hierarchical organizational structure, grossly unequal and exploitative conditions, and a generally Fordist division of labor. Craft discourse and branding in this sense actually functions as a kind of fetishization of work that obscures the conditions of the material labor process, replacing these with instead with the image of some timeless artisan. This positioning rests upon craft capitalism's marquee worker, the craftsperson. Even though the majority of workers in craft-branded industries don't actually participate in handicraft activities. A craftsperson, we might say, is a worker or amateur who produces high-quality objects, typically as commodities. The craftsperson, we should note, is distinct from what we might call the craft worker. That is, someone whose labor contributes to craft in one way or another, but who is not a craftsperson in their own right. If a baker is a craftsperson, the sales associate might be considered a craft worker. This distinction is important in a moment when the terms craft and artisan are used to describe any number of commodities and industries. We hear about craft decor, artisan foods, and bespoke or heritage clothing. But what this terminology obscures is the kinds of labor and the processes of production that go into the creation of each of these objects. In essence, what we see at work in the industrial mythologies of craft and artisanry is a kind of fetish in which the image of the artisan stands in for the actual material processes of craft production. My research follows the methodological orientation of workers' inquiry, an approach to social research that reports on working conditions in workers' own words and with their interests in mind. This is an approach that's driven by the acknowledgement that nobody is better positioned to speak to questions of working conditions, exploitation, or class than is the worker. As many of you probably know, the tradition finds its origins in a questionnaire published by Karl Marx in a French workers' journal toward the end of his life in the late 19th century. It was made up of 101 questions and was intended to guide workers in reflecting on their own working conditions, uncovering for themselves the manner in which they are exploited. This kind of questionnaire format took many, it developed through the 20th century, and now this approach tends to be an approach characterized by more ethnographic forms of research, interviewing, observation, participation, particularly with an eye to organizing. Workers' inquiry is not, as may seem obvious, a neutral approach to inquiry. It brings with it a commitment to the workers' movement, workers' self-organization, drawing upon theoretical and empirical traditions in political economy, philosophy, cultural studies, sociology of work. My research and much of workers' inquiry uses the tools of social sciences and humanities to provide useful data to workers' movements in as accurate and comprehensive a way as possible. And I use workers' inquiry in combination with a variety of other methods and methodological orientations, particularly ethnographic methods and critical discourse analysis, in order to assess the accuracy and credibility of the discourses of these industries, especially these mythologies that the leaders of craft industries tend to promote. And when measuring these industrial mythologies against the attitudes and experiences of workers, we see some of the shortcomings and misdirections that they embody. And in doing so, we might observe some of the changes that need to take place in these industries. Over the course of my doctoral research, I was able to speak with 38 makers, workers, owners, and industry experts, as well as another 7 to 10, I don't actually have the figure in front of me, organizers in independent unions and independent workers networks. These interviews and observations took place in the three major metropolitan areas of the Pacific Northwest, specifically Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. And I was generally interested in two case studies: individually directed and typically entrepreneurial craft production by self-described makers, and the labor process of scalable craft industries, what I call craft industrialism. Many of the workers profiled for this research reported a general movement from jobs in tech toward the appeal of handicraft. Disillusioned with the immateriality of their jobs, feeling isolated by the digitally mediated professional world, many of these workers sought out alternative ways of working and connecting, often gravitating toward maker spaces, which stood out to them as material alternatives to an immaterial world of work. Excuse me. They sought these spaces for collaboration and shared passion, typically finding both, but with the caveat that many makerspaces and making communities have been enclosed by large corporations and big tech financiers. Furthermore, most maker participants reported a general trend toward the aspirational or entrepreneurial in these communities, yet another seepage of the profit motive into what would hopefully be a more collective and autonomous community. The maker movement is an interesting, occupies an interesting position vis-a-vis the digital economy or the platform economy. Many makers occupy themselves with the manufacture of physical goods. They go about this through a combination of traditional processes and more contemporary technologically mediated ones. The maker ethos is one that values doing good work for its own sake, very often necessitating the use of digital tools. At the same time, the maker movement is squarely integrated into the digital world. Beyond the high-tech tools that makers employ, their wares are often marketed on e-commerce platforms like Etsy. Their community space is owned and operated by tech corporations and entrepreneurs. In a sense, the maker movement mobilizes makers' entrepreneurial aspirations while administering them in the ecology of the digital sphere. Craft industrialism, by contrast, attempts to rematerialize craft production, often by attempting to reinvigorate existing industries. Now, here I'm going to skip forward. Typically, I would tell you a little bit about craft industrialism. Suffice to say that here I'm talking about those scalable industries that brand themselves as craft, but really are engaging in a fairly traditional Fordist division of labor, producing a scalable quantity. But instead, I'm going to skip forward and tell you just a little bit about the ways in which independent makers are starting to organize. So up to this point, my research on the interaction between craft and the digital economy has prioritized its analog characteristics. That is to say that I've been focused on the material labor processes of these industries more than I have on their digital processes. The next stage of this project will complete this circuit, so to speak, by examining the e-commerce platforms that mediate the aspirational and leisure work of the craft economy. Although Etsy enjoys a privileged position as the dominant platform in the digital crafts economy, several competitors have recently emerged, perhaps most notably Amazon Handmade, part of Amazon's strategy of dominating online commerce and, by extension, everything. Considerable attention has been paid to these platforms' structures and practices, but there's still room for critical analysis, particularly in terms of how these impact the makers and sellers who depend on Etsy and its fellows to market their wares. Scholars like Susan Luckman and Vinci Lee have begun this work, but my particular interest is in the ways in which makers and sellers respond to challenges in these platforms' business practices. The particular composition of the making workforce that utilizes e-commerce platforms is difficult to pin down, most stats coming directly from the companies themselves. That said, it's a highly gendered workforce and one that is made up of aspirational makers, hobbyists, and business-oriented mass producers alike. Whereas some are supplementing other income, others are grinding out a living through a combination of e-commerce and craft fairs. Changes in billing, promotion, algorithmic sorting, and the like have a profound impact on the livelihoods of these sellers. Recognizing this, in April of last year, many Etsy sellers banded together for a virtual strike. Protesting proposed fee increases, these sellers demanded higher levels of autonomy and representation. During this week-long strike, many sellers put their Etsy shop on vacation mode, selling their wares through other platforms. While the results of the strike are not immediately obvious, one lasting impact is the formation of the Indie Sellers Guild, a collective of crafters, makers, and sellers fighting for better conditions across the online craft economy. While young, the Indie Sellers Guild has joined an international movement of platform workers and users united in the struggle for a more equitable, transparent, and democratic platform economy. However, the Indie Sellers Guild and groups like it differ from the main current of platform organizing in that many makers and craft merchants are not workers in the traditional sense, but hobbyist producers or aspirational entrepreneurs. Much is left to be learned from the efforts of platform leisure workers to fight for better conditions while weighing their demands against those made by more readily recognizable platform and gig workers. In a period characterized by increasing informality, underemployment, and flexibilization, makers, craft merchants, and other leisure workers point us toward an underexplored segment of the platform workforce. Self-employed in much the same way as ride-hailing and food delivery workers, makers and sellers also face conditions of insecurity and absentee management, though these are often obscured by their own aspirational and entrepreneurial motivations. So in the interest of time, I will end it there. I'm a little over time. I'm 15 minutes, so I apologize. But thank you, everybody.